All right, we're going to start the last 40-minute section. So this section will be focused on the lessons and questions from RICA. As the three moderators, having this opportunity to help facilitate this conversation, we did have the opportunity to visit Rwanda and sort of get to see some of the dynamics of the culture, the vibrancy of the place, and the realities of what a lot of this discussion and the project has been responding to. And one thing that really struck me was looking at how the transportation network is sort of this very fine-grained movement of these motorcyclists that are sort of constantly corralling people through the city. And it's kind of in a very different contrast to where the RICA project is. So hopefully that conversation will sort of get to address some of these tensions between this more very urban dynamic setting versus where RICA is situated in this more outskirt area. But to begin, we'll have a presentation from Patricia Gruits, who is a co-executive director of MASS, supports the strategy, development, operations, finance, design, and governance of the North American studios. Her decade-long tenure has seen her working at MASS Boston's Boston studio and in the Africa studio, where she's led design teams on associated projects, including African Leadership University, the Ellen DeGeneres campus of Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund, and the maternity waiting village in Malari. We actually got to go to the Fossey Fund. It was a great project. And then she'll be accompanied by John Paul Sebuhayi Uwase, who is committed to architecture, and that drives social impact. He envisions a world where people have access to architecture that promotes dignity. Since joining MASS in 2011 as an intern, John Paul's role has continuously expanded in scope. He currently serves as the design principal at the Africa Studio, where he guides design projects from conception to construction while managing client relations and ensuring effective collaboration. I'm very excited. I'll let them take the stage.
Thank you very much for the beautiful introduction. I always want to add that I was part of the first class of architecture to be taught in Rwanda. So Sierra, Alan, and Christian, they were my professors, and since then I've been working with them until now. And we're going to be talking about the lessons we learned from RICA, which I think they are millions and millions, and it's very difficult to just talk about them in the time we have, but we'll try. So let's begin with a simple truth that the built environment is never neutral. Every design decision we make about space, what we build, where we build, and for whom either closes the gap or widens this gap. Too often, our buildings, our cities reinforce inequality, intensifying the challenges of climate change, health disparities, and economic exclusion. The space we design shapes the system we live in, and too often those systems deepen divides between rich and poor, urban and rural, human and ecological health. What we build reflects what we value as a society. And historically, it has been used to reinforce inequalities. It can decide who has access to clean air, clean water, light and safety, and who has access to opportunity, and who is left out. That means that the climate crisis, health disparities, and economic exclusions are not separate issues. They intersect in the built environment. Our responsibility as designers, architects, is to disrupt those patterns to build systems that heal and not harm. And because every project, every plan, every design is a chance to build systems that make the world not just more sustainable, but more just, more beautiful, and more alive. We believe it's possible to meet these needs of all people and restore the health of our planet. But to do that, we have to expand what design means, what architecture means. And architecture is not only about making buildings. Landscapes are not just about planting. It is about grappling with the systems that shape our world, economic, ecological, and social. The way forward means ensuring everyone has at least basic things they need to live with dignity and opportunity. That's the social foundation we must rise above. At the same time, we must stay within the limits of what the planet can handle without causing the lasting harm. We create a fair and sustainable space where people and nature can thrive together when we meet both goals. At RICA, we have proved what is possible. We designed a campus that restores biodiversity and natural systems, not just reducing the harm, but actively healing the planet. Every decision at RICA was local, meaning local materials, local craft, the labor, and so on. So thinking about the overall supply chain. This wasn't just about carbon reduction. It was about celebrating ingenuity, local innovation, and creating new jobs and economic opportunities for the communities that live around RICA. The success of this campus can't be measured only by using usual metrics, but rather looking at the overall systems that were created. Like cost per square meter foot isn't enough to define what it is, but the ripple effects on long-term water, energy savings, and rebuilding of ecosystems, and the livelihoods of communities that were impacted. So building locally may sometimes look expensive upfront, but in reality, it invests in resilience, skills, infrastructure, and pride that remain long after the construction ends. Climate-friendly design must be evaluated over time, and not how cheap it was to build, but how well does it sustain life. Over to you, Patricia.
Another lesson, oh, that's not forward, there we go. Another lesson from RICA really is rooted in what Sierra shared earlier about accompaniment and this foundational philosophy of care that Paul Farmer guided us through and really introduced us to, which means that, accompaniment is being present with someone along a journey without a beginning or an end. And RICA really embodies that philosophy of care, that philosophy of accompaniment. An accompaniment of the government, the organization, other community leaders, the funder, community members, future students who didn't even know they were coming to campus yet. And at RICA, that meant for us redefining the role of the architect and the designers and the landscape architects and the engineers, really asking what more could we do at every turn. We had to get upstream of the traditional and typical design phases, not just to design the curriculum, but also to design the program, to design the infrastructure, the roads, before there was even a brief. We had to go outward, looking to agronomists, ecologists, and others outside of the architectural and landscape architecture disciplines to truly understand what was possible on this site and in this place. We had to go deeper in our typical collaboration. Multidisciplinary collaboration has been a fundamental and core practice at Mass. But it wasn't just working with landscape architects and putting everyone in the room. It was about being intentional about who leads when. When does the land lead? When does the architecture lead? When do we actually need to question engineering and come up with new systems and ways of working that haven't been explored yet so that we can truly find innovation? And when do we need to actually go out on a limb and build the thing ourselves? I think the Gesamtkunstwerk was a great sort of lesson lifted up by Dan that is about that total artwork. And we went beyond often thinking not just about what material to use, but about the provenance of that material. I remember being in the Kigali office and seeing this really beautiful map where our team was collectively trying to trace the provenance of materials from supply chain, actually tracing it back to see where it could lead with pins and strings, like a beautiful mind. And that unpacking of provenance of these materials led to the project as you see it today. And this is, for me, a real testament to how we think about accompaniment and going beyond what we traditionally see in the United States or in North America around the AIA basic services. There is nothing about this project that was just about services, and there's nothing about this project that is basic. And so I think a lesson that we can take away is that the designer is not this service provider, but truly a partner on projects to create transformative change in the communities we seek to serve. Another lesson, and one that sort of transcends outside of RICA, but surely is core to MAS's way of working, is that RICA was just designed with such incredible intention. I think we see it through all the presentations over the last 24 hours. The intention to sort of zoom out at the right moment to think broadly about the ecological systems at work, the plants and their selection and the propagation that needs to go into finding and selecting them. Then to sort of think about what material do we use in the construction? Where does that wood come from? But then design it to be a butterfly roof that collects water that can go back and feed the plants that we're trying to cultivate. The design and the site also are sort of a part of the students' learning in that experience. This is not just a setting for education, but the campus teaches. It's a living laboratory where students and community members see how conservation and regeneration work in practice. Classrooms that are made of rammed earth are where you learn about soil health and walk out into an ecosystem where the lessons are made for you to live in. The students don't just study regeneration, they live it. And in this way, we are learning as architects and as designers to connect space and experience, to connect values and construction, and to connect the way that we live to the mission and the values that we want to see in the world.
Last not least, let's talk about beauty, which is something that kept coming up today. At MAS, we hold the fundamental belief, a radical belief, that beauty is not a luxury. It's a fundamental human right. Everyone, everywhere, deserves beauty. And it is our responsibility as designers to create this beauty for our own communities. So it nurtures belonging, elevates dignity, and changes how people see themselves and see their communities. RICA became a demonstration that beauty doesn't have to be imported. Actually, it doesn't have to be something that we see looking shiny. In the example of RICA, it was crafted locally by the local communities, the same people who are now benefiting from this beautiful campus. This is a type of beauty you can not only see, you can feel it. I think many people have appreciated the photos, but if you go to the campus, you get to really experience what I'm talking about here now. So the result is a proof that beauty can be regenerative, rooted in culture, craft, and care. So we tap into the potential of local habitats, resources, and labor to lift up narratives of culture and craft to root our projects within the communities we serve. And by this, I'll pause by here, and thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much for that great presentation. We'll go right into the roundtable section. I'll be introducing the panelists that will be joining the discussion. First, we have Mehrotra, who's a professor of urban design and planning and the John T. Dunlop Professor of in Housing and Urbanization at GSD, the founding principal of Mumbai-based RMA Architects. RMA Architects, founded in 1990, has designed and executed projects including government and private institutions, corporate workplaces, private homes, unsolicited projects driven by the firm's commitment to advocacy in the city of Mumbai. Next will be joining us is Joan Busquets, who is the inaugural Martin Buckham Professor in Practice of Urban Planning and Design at GSD, and chair of the Veronica Green Prize of Urban Design in this year's installation. Prior to joining the GSD faculty, Busquets was chair professor of town planning and urban design in School of Architecture at the Polytechnic University of Barcelona from 1979 to 2002, and is a world-renowned urban planner, urban designer, architect. Busquets serves as the urban planning for Barcelona City Council during the formative years from 1983 to 1989, and in preparation for the Barcelona Olympics in 1992, including the new downtown program for the city and the improvement process for existing neighborhoods. Last but not least, will be joining us is Toni Griffin, who is a professor in practice of urban planning at GSD and a faculty affiliate of the Bloomberg Center of Cities. Her teaching portfolio includes cross-disciplinary option studios, MDES open projects, and seminars devoted to gentrification, neighborhood change, and design for Just City. In addition to teaching, Toni is the founding director of Just City Lab, a research platform that investigates how designs impact on social and spatial justice in cities. So we have quite the powerhouse of people to help us.
Keep us in check. You all need microphones, Heather?
Yeah, so we'll be starting the roundtable. This is going to be focused on the lessons from RICA. Something that I think is very timely about the project is given how young Africa's population is and the fact that this project is a campus project. It definitely highlights the value of having dignified spaces for the young generation of educators, leaders, and practitioners in our cities all across the continent. And so to kind of start the conversation, I'm curious to have a bit more of an elaboration on how you guys came to the conclusion of how the curriculum is structured on this campus site. You kind of have this choreography of buildings that sort of twist, turn, and stagger across the site. And I've already heard a lot about it, but I think the audience might benefit from hearing a little bit more about that as well.
Sure. Maybe I can start and then hand it over to you, JP. I think we've mentioned a lot about the One Health framework, right? The sort of balance or finding balance between ecological, animal, and human health. And that really was the foundational kind of understanding of the project and the curriculum as it evolved. And how do you make that real? How do you make that tangible for people, not just as they're on site, but actually, also in the curriculum? And so a lot of times, I think the curriculums that we had studied or looked at were placing things as either or. It was either benefiting kind of a conservation agenda or a human kind of productivity agenda or a conservation agenda instead of maybe one that was more agricultural. And so I think our team really approached this not with an either or attitude, but an and attitude in all three of those. And so you heard a lot from my colleagues about talking about the year one and how do you actually create a curriculum where people are actually living not just in a space where they're learning about agriculture, but they're actually learning in a relevant scale and kind of with challenges that they are going to face and have faced in their own communities on these sort of small land holdings. And how do you actually intensify production on that land to address the challenge of food security long term in a country that is growing at such a rapid pace? And then year two, we talked a bit about the evolution of that program into value production, right? So we think about not just growing tomatoes, but how does it turn into tomato paste? Not just how do you keep a cow and milk it, but how do you then create additional value by turning it into cheese or yogurt? And so those are critical processes that actually help people understand not just how to do a job, but actually how to create jobs and how to do it in a way that actually brings in more income to you, your family, and your community. And then in year three, those forming of cooperatives is that actual testing, is that kind of evolution. And I think there's something about the intentionality of how the buildings work, as Alan mentioned, that you actually are changing the way that you are taking ownership as a student. You're not just there being lectured at and learning outside of the classroom. The landscape is your teacher. The landscape is where you're learning. And as much as possible, we were trying to connect to that more holistic, heuristic experience, not separating. I think oftentimes you see or not see, but there's a trend, I think, in sort of higher education in Africa to sort of extract individuals from their community. They come and learn at wonderful institutions like Harvard or Yale, and then they go back. And institutions like Rwanda are really offering high quality education where students are able to learn in place and address the challenges that are happening in their communities in the moment, so they graduate ready to launch, right?
Thanks, Patricia. I will share a personal experience. The time we were working on this project, like in the early days of it, we wanted to understand like what is the kind of transformation we want the school to have on the communities of Rwanda, which more than 80% live from agriculture. So we had to understand like what is the scale, what is the size of a farm, a typical farm in Rwanda. And the first sketch that I did was a sketch of my own parents' house, which has a backyard with a banana plantation and then a cow barn on the side, which is pretty much, majority of what the Rwandan rural homes are. And we were asking, like, if you're a student, you have to learn about farming and agriculture, and you're going to be working with the same communities when you graduate. So you have to understand the kind of life they live in. So we're trying to link the curriculum, but also the way of living and the way of practicing. I think you've seen from the photos and the drawings, the first year housing that Patricia just talked about. It was more of a reflection of what that life of a farmer that he lives in, which wanted the student to go through the same process as the first thing you learn when you get to university. And then it has to inform then what you do, and then you can be able to develop your own way of learning, but also keeping in mind how you can go back and help the same farmers.
Great. I also want to give the chance for the rest of our panelists to maybe have a reaction to just the presentations that Patricia and John Paul gave us, and also in this question about pedagogy and education as well.
Hello? Hi. Well, thank you all, and thank you, students, for just your amazing and brilliant and thoughtful questions. I'm just always impressed when dialogues in the school are facilitated by you. I think you guys sometimes do a much better job than us, so I've been enjoying the time that I've been here. I have the mic first, but I had a different set of maybe reflections to offer, which won't be exactly in response to what you teed up. But since I have the mic and you encouraged me to go first, I'm going to start with my own. And I think I want to try to frame them as additional lessons, certainly the ones that I picked up, but I think that are embedded in the project that I think you might also amplify. And maybe you are, and I'm just using different languages for them. And I want to go back to an image that was in Alan's presentation, which was the image of a group of Rwandans just sort of staring back at me. It was just so visceral and powerful to me to be in a space where someone who looks like me is staring back at me. I'm not often in those spaces. This room is an example. And I just started to imagine, like, well, what is it like for you all at Mass to be in that context where you're sitting in a room that doesn't look like you? And what do you do to build that? And you talked about it in a number of different ways, and it just made me think about, well, what does it mean to be in community or of community? Am I working on a community or am I working in a community? And just how you all as students grapple with that when you go out in the world and work in places that are different than what you know with people who are different from you. So that image just carried so much for me, and it's embodied in the project altogether. And it made me think of one of my favorite scholars. She's a political theorist, kind of sociologist, social feminist, Iris Marion Young. She has this amazing book called The Politics of Difference. And it made me think of two things that her work deals with that I think are also lessons that are coming from your work, which is about the politics of difference. And it's also about these critiques around social justice, because I think your work embeds a lot of justice. So on the aspect of politics of justice, Young argues that achieving social justice requires explicitly recognizing and addressing group differences. And I think the way you have to work through this accumulated continuum requires you to accept difference and to work from it, rather than attempting to be difference blind and not going in and saying we're all the same. You are not the same. And so the way in which these principles that you work on around proximity and accompaniment, and I also add in embeddedness, requires that you're building relationships. You're not doing community engagement. You're not doing engagement at all, really. It's relationship building. And I think that's an important lesson for students to take away from this project, the idea that it's relationship that you're building to do this work in spaces, places that are different from you, that you don't know. That is so important, and this project represents 15 years of building those relationships. And so it's through a process like that, where you're building relationships, that you're able to root this in values, which is the slide that a number of you talked about in that circle. Because this is a long-term project, but it's always tethered to the intention of the values, right? What you thought you were going to do in 5 years, time passes, 10 years you might have to adapt and do something different, as you did, but it was still rooted to the values. So this work around centering the values of the intention of your work is also important. Just really quickly, the second one is around this notion of justice. And part of the framing of justice that I use in my work is to really unpack its differences. And one of the most conventional ones is around distributed justice, which is really about the distribution of fairness. Did everybody get the same thing? I think what you're doing, which is something Iris Mary Run critiques, is that distributed justice isn't just about the material distribution of fairness. It is about the non-material distribution of that. So the sharing of decision-making, the sharing of co-creation. And so the ecosystem that you created around how craftsmen are part of this, the fact that one of the lessons Sierra talked about, which is how this translates into mechanisms of procurement and capacity building that enables procurement. That is not a material real estate land distribution. It is a non-material distribution. So I think that's also a super important lesson that I take from your work that I would encourage you to also daylight. But in that, one of the things, the last thing I'll say is, I was really wanting to see how this ecosystem of living beings on this land actually live on the land. There are not a lot of images of how this thing functions as this ecosystem of multiple species in relationship with one another, in relationship with the land and in the building and each other. And I would love to see, as you do this again, coming out of this prize, and you'll be asked to talk about it, help us now connect some of the narrative that you've been talking about all afternoon and last night to some of the imagery of then how this beautiful thing you created, the values, really the circle. How does it now live and breathe as this integrated, accumulated space that holds all these things? And I think that would just put the cherry on the top of realizing the lessons that you've learned and the examples.
I think I'd like to stress an idea that already yesterday was presented. The idea that it seems the RICA can become a model, which I think this is very interesting. And probably one of the biggest attributes that today you pointed out is the idea that the integration of design disciplines, which I think is very important. When we take models, sometimes we tend to imagine, well, the Global South, can they produce models? Or they are always have to adapting the models that they are coming from the North and the West. I think there is a good example for me that is the Curitiba model. Curitiba is a small city, relatively small city in Brazil, that 20 years ago they invented one model that today is transferred all over. Recently I saw the application of the Curitiba model that is 2 million inhabitants in Mexico City that is 22 million inhabitants. The model consists with the idea that you have to make the transportation very efficient, and where you put the efficient transportation, you allow higher density, meaning that then the people will be reacting and using the advantage of the transportation. And by doing that, you create a model for the city. That has been replicated many, many times in many cities. And I think it's quite amazing. And I think going back to the RICA, I would say, how would you describe what is the essential of your model that can be not transferred? Because when you see the Curitiba model, it's not exactly the same, but it's the principle. Really, the principle is this idea, in my eyes, is this idea of the integration of disciplines, in a way that sometimes you mentioned before, sometimes landscape takes the lead, but the others, but they are not apart from that. Usually in the Western world, we are very much, even here at the school sometimes, we feel that the departments are independent, and they should not be, because they are, that they're into the school, or the students are coming to the school, because it's the design that makes them together. No? And I think this idea of the model, I think, has a lot of power, and we have to imagine that when we're talking about the model, we are not imagining something that is replicated everywhere. You can see that, for instance, even the Western world tried to get and to incorporate the Curitiba model, is what we today we call the TOD, the transit-oriented development. But it's not the same. Transit-oriented is based on the idea of the nodes, but that was already invented before. But this idea that you create something that density and efficiency are tied together, I think that was very strong. And in your case, I think this idea that landscape, nature, production, and buildings with the quality, I think for us, as part of the jury, for us what was important is this idea that this project can be seen, and we can imagine this project could be in the outskirts of Brussels, or the outskirts of Boston. And these things could happen. And I think this is what is very important. It's not a project that we look at because the African pedigree. No, it's because the quality of the project. And I think this is what I would like very much to stress in your idea, or the idea that I'm suggesting for the model. Thank you.
No, thanks very much. You know, it's a wonderful idea to have as this last panel, this reflection and learning. And I want to kind of continue, Alan, with the question I was asking you, mainly in the spirit of the fact that I think my comments are going to be from the perspective we are trying to build these cases. We are going to try to see how we can be more expansive about urban design and how we can learn. So it's really fill those gaps. So my reflections come from that, and they sort of are going to go through three scales as quickly as I can. One is, I think, just the kind of expansive dimension you've critically added to the idea of urban design, right? I think Peter was framing it as Desicota, where it's going to be a landscape, and I was really glad to see the presentation where you showed us how these principles get sort of could be applied perhaps to post-industrial or Rust Belt sort of small towns. And I think that's a very critical question. I might call it urban design because it really blurs the boundary between the rural and the urban, and in a kind of new formation where the parameters are quite different because landscape becomes an organizing principle, and actually architecture is placed in the interstitial space rather than the other way around. So it's a wonderful imaginary in the way one could actually expand this idea. And it's truly an ecological urban design where the networks of the components, the domains that you've identified all work in some synergy and therefore create another kind of imaginary in terms of the image of the place, let's say, correct? Where it's not premised on architecture being the central spectacle or even organizing instrument of that landscape. And I think that is, it's a wonderful contribution if we can position it within the practice of urban design as mindfully as this. Otherwise, you would whisk it off as some suburban development. No, that's incorrect. I think we have to draw it into the parameters of what might be urban design. And then I think one extends it also. I think what resonates with me very much is it's also a new imaginary of social infrastructure, one that's expansive. I think infrastructure has become very, as a notion, as a rubric, as an imaginary, has become very disruptive in our cities. It actually most often divides communities, not integrates them. And good infrastructure that gets fully embedded in communities. It dissolves within the fabric of communities. And I think this is where you've taken landscape and architecture and made it do that. So one can also make a wonderful argument of this as a piece of social infrastructure as a rubric to describe the project. And that takes me to my last 2 points, which come closer to architecture. The word context, from the first presentation, the word context was used a lot. You guys are very mindful of context. And so let's expand that, because, I mean, context as we understand it is, you know, the sun, its movement, the wind, the nature of the land, the adjacencies, perhaps, right? We get more ambitious as we excavate the site even further, and you've shown us how you do that. You excavate it not only in terms of its geological composition, but also plant material. You begin to get expansive in terms of territory, and you begin to look at adjacencies, not at what's adjacent to the site boundary, but the adjacencies of the networks that for material supply, etc. So you're complicating context in a very interesting way. So you're actually getting to the point of nestling that context in its broader context. And then you're getting to the continent almost, right? You even have diagrams with planetary limits, right? So it's the context of the context. And really, it's through that complication that you begin to surface intersections that become really critical points to intervene as designers, which is, I think, what you've done. And it also then begins to inform the architecture in an interesting way. And here I'm going to actually just, it's interesting, you know, I do a class that's called Decentering the Canon, in a way not saying Global South and setting it up as a binary, but just decentering the canon. And one of the quotations I use from Pedro Levi-Bismarck, who is a professor at the University of Porto, and it's a lovely piece he's written. It's a much longer essay. I'm just going to share a few lines where he basically argues that often when architecture occurs and gets awarded in the Global South, he questions whether it's really good architecture, or does it get layered on poverty and underdevelopment to give it legitimacy, correct? And that becomes, I think, a really valid question to ask. And I think what you've done is challenge that, because with the students, we interrogate many projects with this. So I'm just going to read out this little passage to show how you've exactly challenged it and gone beyond exactly what he's criticizing. And he says, the act of romanticizing the artisan thus accomplishes the same function as nature landscape apparatus if the latter softens the contrasts and the inequalities of capitalist spatial production. The former, by sustaining the myth of original happiness in labor, naturalizes the artisan's indigent social and economic condition. For once, the job is finished. She has no choice but to return to the field of slums without qualities and the eternal destiny reserved to her by the caste and the capitalist economy. Such an alternative means of production can never be found in an architecture that renounces to critically assess the territory where it's embedded, the space which it transforms and produces. The question begs for a deeper inquiry into the means, discourses, and the practices through which architecture can probe and challenge the prevailing processes of territorial production, the mechanisms at play, often violent, that the forms of life and modes of existence at stake. Only by establishing a dialogue with this problematic exteriority can one hope to address such fundamental questions. The unstable bond between humans and nature, and the revival of artisan constructive techniques beyond all fetishization, right? And I think that is really a big contribution of your project and a lot of the mass work. And I think here we've seen an accumulation, as Stephen described, of an extraordinary project where your empathy, your mindfulness, your analytical skills to engage with the territorial dimension within which these inequalities are situated makes that architecture incredibly robust, resilient, and worth replication. So thank you very much.
I think it's been really good to see that I did not need any questions. You guys have crossed so many topics and made this really rich. I would like to give Patricia and John Paul maybe a chance to pick out some of these parts and maybe a quick response before we move on.
No, I mean, thank you so much for your insightful and incredible questions. Joseph, thank you for kicking it off in such a thoughtful way, too. A lot to respond to and a lot to take with us, too, as we think about this project and about what's next at Mass. And, I'll start, I think, by, the idea of the model. It's embedded in our name, Model of Architecture Serving Society. I think we're constantly striving to think about how we can model the way that we work, the way that we practice, the way that we show up for our partners, what we design for our community, but also beyond it. And at the risk of, I think, really reacting against the idea of a prototype and something that can just be, sort of exported and dropped in all conditions and all contexts. And I think, Rahul, you hit on it. I think we are deeply contextual in a way that I think does expand sometimes to the planets. But often, I think planetary. Yeah. No, beyond. I'm saying but to the planetary boundary. No, but I think that is. I think that's you're hitting on something that is really unique. Having lived in this practice for the last 13 years, that I think is really special and really core. Because it's not. It's also it's looking at the context to understand what we can see and what is visible, but to more importantly understand, I think, and unpack what is invisible and what you can't see, and the systems that have come before that are shaping what we see both in the built environment and in the social and economic and environmental conditions in which we're working. And if we do not understand them, and if we do not really acknowledge them, then we risk perpetuating them. And I think that is core to what we do. And Toni, just to go to your comment, I think it's really wonderful that slide resonated with you, and I think it is such a big part of our practice. And hearing you say that, I'm like, woof, what images are on the decks that we didn't include that articulate that part of the process of the community participation. What you might not see in that image is actually our colleague Noella, who's in the front of that room. And I think, and there's so, and I, and I think, the team that we have, is a really interesting team. We've had oftentimes people think of Mass being located in Boston or in the US, but actually our primary and main office is in Kigali, made up of now, I think, mostly 90% or more of Rwandans who are leading the office. Christian and John Paul is a fraction of representation. But I think core to the way that we've worked and tried to unpack this kind of difference, or the ways that we can be from a place and not from a place, is to really reflect and understand, I think, anthropologically, those two that are often put at odds with each other, the emic, right? That you could only really understand a place by being from it in order to understand the culture. The etic, which, you can really understand a culture by seeing it in comparison to others. And I think at Mass, the way that we're able to understand our roles and the value of each of those, to deeply understand what is local, what is historic, what is cultural, what is relational, what is unseen, what is unspoken, what makes, what allows someone to feel comfortable and build that trust with me or with you or with someone else that they couldn't otherwise if they weren't from that place. And what allows us to see and learn from precedents and from the global context to zoom up into the scale of the system, right? So that we aren't just operating locally and having impact on a local, direct impact on the user and the student and the community member, but actually also zooming back out to understand the systems change that we are participating in. And I think working in that way, and when we work in Native communities, it's a Native, non-Native collaboration that I think also applies to every context we work. And understanding that as a reciprocal relationship that requires us to understand our difference, and ourselves.
Real
Please.
quick, I didn't mention your colleague Noelle on purpose. Of course, I noticed her, because I'm also just trying to shine a light on the fact in this country in particular, and it's important that the students know that there's a founding office in Rwanda, and the composition of that. The face of Mass here is not that, and so you are working across continents and across your own interpersonal relationship building as a practice. And so this question of how do you work through the politics of difference as colleagues, as well as on the ground is embedded in the way you've set yourself up. And so I have this last question in my phone, which is, what are the things that you had to unlearn, to make this work? Because some of you are going into places that are very different from you and having a role, and you maybe are having to unlearn some things that we taught you here as you go out in the world and sort of experience the difference between practice and practicing within the context of that. So, maybe this is another conversation for another time, but I think that those are really important lessons that students who are going out in the world and looking for really different and entrepreneurial places to be impactful. I think students want to be impactful more than professional in some ways, which means, the way in which you've set your work up is modeling new forms of that, and embedded in that is this politics of difference. So I don't know if we have time to talk about that, but that was a little bit why I did not mention Noel, but I did see.
So we're going to end this section right here. Oh, well, I guess we'll let the show continue. As briefly as you can, please.
Yes, very briefly. I will speak as an African architect, a Rwandan architect. Our countries in Africa are racing to develop, and I'm concerned that most of our leaders are trying to copy what the developed countries have done. And we often see, mistakes. We often criticize, the impacts that the development has had on the planet. And to me, I think RICA should be, one of the examples that we are able, African architects, designers and planners, we are able to create solutions that are responding to our own needs, but developing in a better way without having to copy what other people have done, but developing in our own and unique way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful. Joan will now take over for the next section.
Sure. Okay. I think we are ending, and as we close our celebration for the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture campus by Mass, as the 15th recipient of the Veronica Rudge Green Prize in Urban Design, let us also honor the vision that brought the prize at this moment into being. The Green Prize is a legacy shaped by Dr. Michael von Clem, Harvard College class of 1957, whose remarkable life spanned continents and disciplines. During his time living among the Washaga tribe in Tanzania, and through involvement in the East African Development Bank, Dr. von Clem witnessed firsthand the power of connection and the transformation effects of community principles at the very heart of the great urban design. He began his career as crime reporter for the Boston Globe and taught at the Harvard Business School. His journey from Harvard to Africa, from teaching to global finance, taught him that when people come together, they can build not just places, but possibilities. Inspired by this conviction, Dr. von Clem established the Veronica Rudge Green Prize in Urban Design that this morning was explained by Professor Peter Rowe with a lot of detail, through a generous and, at that time, anonymous gift to illuminate and encourage urban design that shapes a more humane and more vibrant world. We are deeply grateful to his family for their dedicated stewardship of his legacy. Tonight, we recognize Mass for their vision, dedication, and the extraordinary impact of the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agricultural Campus, a project that represents the very ideals this prize seeks to celebrate. Let us raise our glasses to the lasting influence of philanthropy, to the boundless possibilities of inspired design, to all who work to make our cities and communities places of hope and dignity, to Dr. Von Clem vision, to Mass, and to the future we build together. Cheers. Cheers.